If you have an orchid that's planted in pure sphagnum moss like this one is, then fertilization is going to be a little different. Since sphagnum moss will absorb tremendous amounts of water, nutrients, or any extra fertilizers that you add, you need to fertilize it differently than if this orchid was planted in bark, perlite, charcoal, and any other material. So in this video, I'm going to show you 3 methods of how to fertilize your orchids planted in sphagnum moss. Hi, I'm Amanda Matthews, and thank you for watching this video at Orchideria. So sphagnum moss is a little different when it comes to fertilization. I'll summarize the methods up front, then I'll dive into each one so you know where we're going. The first one is to water the day before and apply fertilizer the day after. The second one is to water a few hours before and then fertilize a few hours after. And the third one is to use an orchid mister. Before we go into all these, let's first realize what sphagnum moss does and why it needs to be fertilized differently than other potting media. Sphagnum moss, no matter what kind you use, like there's this one, and no, I am not sponsoring these. I'm not sponsoring anything. And there's this, which tends to dry out a lot faster than this one will. But there are several kinds of sphagnum moss that you can use and can buy. Just stay away from peat moss, even if it has sphagnum written on the label. The orchids that will do best in sphagnum moss are seedlings, because their roots are very fine and that they can travel through the sphagnum moss without any difficulty. The second group of orchids that you might want to try with sphagnum moss are mini Phalaenopsis and orchids that like to have a higher humidity around them at all times, because sphagnum moss will retain more humidity, and that's why we have to fertilize differently. Sphagnum moss will absorb more than all those others, and they will slowly release them. It's not that they absorb them and keep them. Sphagnum moss is good because it releases them over time. So even if you use a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of fertilizer, that sphagnum moss will absorb it quickly and will release it slowly over time. So the first thing you need to do is reduce the doses of fertilizer in your mix. We already know that you have to use less than what's recommended on the fertilizer package, but in the case of pure sphagnum moss, use even less, because that is going to release so slowly, but it will release. So let's dive into the 3 methods. The first method is the day before. I have this orchid, which I watered yesterday, and the sphagnum moss is still pretty damp. And you want to know something awesome? Most people think you cannot apply fertilizer directly to the roots because it's going to cause root burn. That's not true. You know why? Because think about orchids back in nature. In nature, they're attached to the tree, they're on the tree for life, and it hasn't rained, and all of a sudden the humidity starts rising and then it downpours. So what's going to happen, the roots are going to be already dry, but they're sensing a rise in humidity. So that's where the important thing comes in. It's not because you applied fertilizer directly to the roots. They can absorb that. They're fine with that. It's the quantity. Because when it rains in the rainforest, it's going to bring down all these chemical elements of leftover droppings from animals, leftover fruit, like rotting fruit that's still hanging on the tree, and it's going to drip through that and bring that down. The water on the bark is going to trickle through and absorb those tannins, which is perfect for the orchid. It just gets all these nutrients from the rain, and those roots are dry. So it's not that the dry roots get root burn because you didn't water them first. It's because you used too much fertilizer. So getting that out of the way, you can apply fertilizer with water directly to all your orchids. But if they're in sphagnum moss, you need to apply less. And that's why it's better to let the sphagnum moss absorb that water the day before than when you're going to water it. So I already watered this yesterday, and today I'm just going to water it with a water that already has fertilizer in it. So this is way more than the recommended dose. I'm going to put half of it back. I mean, just a little tiny bit. Put it inside my water, and I am using distilled water. And this particular brand turns the water blue. Then you're going to fertilize, you're going to water your orchid the same way you would naturally. Don't pour it on the crown, because even though water sitting on the crown doesn't cause crown rot, because orchids in nature, water will get on the crown when it rains. When it rains on everything. You want to water the side of the sphagnum moss. And that is enough for this orchid, because that sphagnum moss is, first, it's already wet, so it's not going to absorb that much, which is good. You don't want a lot, and it will slowly release that over time. Now, since I watered this now, I'm going to put it back on the shelf, and I'm going to keep the fan on so it can dry out any excess water and also dry out that sphagnum. Orchids like to be dry too. So here's that first method. The second method is almost exactly the same, except in between one day and the next, you're only going to wait 4 hours. Now with sphagnum, I watered this earlier this morning, and it's still, as you can see, dripping wet. So, and yes, that is a cakey. And it's going to not absorb that much water compared to the first example. So when I want to fertilize this, I can use the same amount that I use with my other orchids, because the sphagnum being wet won't absorb that much. It will absorb less, as I already said, than the first one. So I don't have to go through all that preparation of using one water that has less fertilizer for some orchids. And for me, that doesn't work. I like something that's more practical, and let's get this going. And so that's not going to absorb much anything, which is perfect. They don't need much anything. They need fertilizer, but not much of it. So let's do this one. And now I can put that back on my shelf and let it dry out. The third method is one where you don't use a fertilizer in water at all. All you do is use a mist. I'm not even sure if this works. It has such a small concentration that it's almost like buying water, really. I haven't been too satisfied, but let's see. And remember, orchids will absorb more nutrients through the underside of their leaves. There's no use fertilizing it from the top. That does nothing, because the top, especially of Phalaenopsis orchids, they are hydro-repellent. It just bounces off the roots and runs elsewhere, usually to the crown. That's why if you don't have a fan that's circulating, it's going to give it crown rot. So the water hits the top of the roots and just runs off. What you need to do is mist the underside of the roots, and that's all it needs. I mean, this has like hardly any fertilizer in it. It's mainly water. You're paying a lot for water. And if you see any little root, which I see one, I'm going to aim for that one. And there, that's the third method. These aren't the only 3 ways that you can fertilize orchids. There are many other ways if you don't want to use store-bought products. And one that I recommend is in this video up here about tea bags, of how you can use tea bags in your orchid. And the other is a more complex guide of the fertilizing methods. And it will be a longer video, but it's at the end I'll show you a download that you can go to. Thank you so much for watching, and happy cultivating.